Right, thank you very much. Very exciting to be here today. No one mentioned it enough. This is the first API Days conference of 2023 here in Singapore. So you're going to hear all the greatest and latest stuff that vendors like myself, analysts like Manju, and clients like Standard Charter are going to be willing to talk about in 2023. So very exciting for that to be here in Singapore. I thought since this is a conference called API Days, I'm going to talk about APIs for a change. And in particular, I'm going to focus on API management, and that's why that is important, and how we're seeing API management as a discipline as well as an architecture evolving towards new paradigms. My name is Claudio Tag. I have the privilege to be the chief architect for what we call automation in IBM, the company I work for. Automation includes integration and API management as disciplines. So Manju did a fantastic job earlier this morning introducing the need for API management and what Gartner says API product management. I'm just going to reel back to a couple of key points. Why are APIs so popular? Why are they so important? They're all about the data that we want to provide. No one cares about the protocol or the mediation that you use. They want that business data that is relevant to them. And this is why a proper API strategy is a strategy that privileges that data as a product. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. But since you're all here, I wanted to do a quick quiz. Do you know what this represents? It took me more time to create this slide than the entire deck. So please do have a guess. Any thought? Anyone? I'm sorry? I can't quite hear. Speak up, speak up. Oh, okay, yes, it's the movement of things across the sea. It's particularly the movement of one person across the world. So this is the journey of Sir Thomas Stanford Raffles in his 40-year journey from a ship in the Caribbean Sea where he was born in the 1700s, through back and forth to the UK, Indonesia, Malaysia, even stop at St. Helena to say hello to Napoleon, as you would do if you're Stanford Raffles, until he created modern Singapore in the 1800s. Why am I putting this up there? Not only because we're in Singapore, but because to create something that is of value takes time, and it takes mistakes that we're going to make along the way, but we can learn from those mistakes. And lesson learned are what allow us to accelerate the next iteration of that same journey. I'm going to go back to this theme in a second, now that you've recognized Mr. Raffles. Those mistakes are what we constantly do if we don't have a strong API management solution in place. Without API management, and Manju again spoke about this to a certain extent, I'm going to have a plethora of different endpoints within my organization that I'm not even going to be able to be aware of. I'm not even going to be able to discover. That means that every time that I want to create a new way of exposing and consuming business data, I might end up redeveloping something, creating a very fragmented experience, having a governance and versioning nightmare unless I've got very solid, very strict principles with CI/CD and automation that I've got to impose to every developer organization within my enterprise, which is hard. And finally, without strong API management, security, and again, I'm piggybacking on everything Manju said, security is going to be a problem. If APIs are treated like just a door into your back-end applications, you need to secure that door. Otherwise, this creates a new exposure surface, which is nothing like everything we've seen before. So what is that experience that led us to create a very mature model that we call the API management model today? We got into a point in which we understand that API management is all about API providers and API consumers. As a provider, I want to be able to create my API, test it, publish it, and then pushing it to a gateway typically that allows me to secure that API without impacting my back-end application. At that point, I pass it to the managers which makes sure that that API is visible, discoverable by my external consumers as well as my internal consumers. There was mention earlier today about treating your employees as customers. Absolutely, yes. My consumers are consumers independently from where they live within or outside the organization. As those APIs are now discoverable, socialized, I want to be able to subscribe to them, consume them, and I also want to be able to share analytics around how that API is used so that the next time we go into that continuum, the next version of that API is going to be better than what I had now. So we've created this model, which is fairly mature. It took us maybe 10 years to get to this point. And I'm not talking about IBM here. Everything I'm saying, apart from maybe the last 3 minutes of my pitch, are very generic concepts. We created this model based on what was the most popular protocol and set of interaction patterns that we've seen for APIs. Traditionally, web services with SOAP and XML, and today, really REST with JSON payloads. We got to a point in which we've got a very mature standard to describe this type of APIs. Is called the Open API Specification. Used to be Swagger in this 1.0 days, now is at 3.0. And based on RESTful APIs and web services, we've created an architectural model which is able to support all of those steps in that continuum and that API lifecycle management that we mentioned in a pretty well-adopted architecture. That's true for many different vendors out there. At the core of this architecture, you've got a gateway. A gateway is the core, the heart, the runtime of your API management solution. That's what does the exposure, the disintermediation, and the securing, the application of policies like access management, rate limiting. All of that happens in the gateway. Your external consumers or even your internal consumers cannot access your backend applications because of that gateway. So that's the core. The brain of an API management solution is the manager. It's where you define the API definition using a Swagger, using Open API Specification. It's where you create those policies, you create your user access control, and you create the products that wrap those APIs, where you do that product management that we were talking about earlier, and then publishing it to the gateway. And finally, your developer portal is your catalog, is your shop window into your API services. Is what you use to socialize, make that data available to the consumers. And if we go back to the first thing that I said, all they care about is the data. They want to find what they need and quickly build something that consumes the data that you're exposing or you're selling to a certain extent. So that, in that far-fetched analogy that I started with, that's my 24-hour plane journey from the Caribbean Sea to Singapore direct without 40 years of backwards and forwards. It took us 10 years, not 40 like Raffles, but we're there, we're happy. We're there for REST, we're there for SOAP, but there is more. My esteemed colleagues at Solace yesterday did a fantastic presentation around what they call event-driven APIs or event-based APIs. There are other protocols, and you've heard it scattered here and there in these 2 days, that are emerging as standards that people want to use to create APIs that go beyond REST. GraphQL being one, asynchronous protocols, event-based protocols like Kafka and Solace, NMQ, MQTT, AMQP, you mentioned it. It's a vast set of new things that feel like APIs, behave like APIs, most importantly, bring out the same data that RESTful API do, but are not REST. So, the concerns that come with all of these new protocols, if they're used to expose data, and these new patterns, if they're used to consume and expose data, are the same of that mature API management model we've mentioned. I still need to care about securing my endpoints. I still need to care about making sure that the access control to my data is well controlled, well regulated. I still need to make sure that I socialize the data that I put out so that it can be consumed. And I still need to care about things like lifecycle management. All of that is true for traditional RESTful. I've started calling traditional now. And things like events, and things like asynchronous, and things like GraphQL. And that's what we call multi-form API management. The idea of taking principles and mature architectural models that we developed over 10 years of experience with REST and making them accessible to novel protocols that are the ones that developers and API consumers might be happy to use because they give them the data that they're interested in. I'm putting out some of those, GraphQL, Kafka, because those are very popular. By no means this is the extent of these modern protocols. We see this as something that will continuously evolve and will increase the number of protocols and interaction patterns that people will want to consume. But this is where we're starting from. This is what we're seeing. And I'm going to talk about two in particular because I think those are quite exciting. I'm going to start with GraphQL. Who in the room is familiar with GraphQL or has heard of GraphQL? All right, not quite 50%, so I'm going to spend 2 words to do a very high-level description of what GraphQL is, and the experts in the room, please forgive me. All right, so if we look at REST as it was intended, RESTful is representational state transfer protocol, which is all about taking a resource, some data in my backend, creating a representation of that resource, and making that representation and the data that is part of that representation available to a consumer. It was very tightly resource scoped. Since it was such a good protocol to use because it used HTTP method to query or poll with put, get, post, and delete, it became very widely adopted, which meant we started using REST beyond what it was originally intended for. We started doing concatenation of REST calls. We started doing complex, stateful passing of data between REST calls, pagination. Using RESTful APIs is not as elegant as we would have imagined if you start building complex stuff in REST. On a completely different domain, there is something called structured query language that we invented probably where Stanford Raffles was going around the Pacific, which is a query language to get data out of databases. With query languages like SQL, what you do is that you spend time creating a complex request that gives you back exactly the data you need, no more, no less. Why am I mentioning SQL? Because GraphQL, graphical query language, is a way of using HTTP endpoints like REST to get data out through a query that gives you back exactly the data you need. What is the advantage of that? Precision, you get what you need, no more, no less. Performance, the query is optimized to give you what you need. You save a lot of backwards and forwards. Byproduct of that, sustainability. You're not going to spend 20 calls to get to what you need. You've got one call. Yesterday, Ian talked about the fact that just with connectivity and communication, the energy spent is the equivalent of powering 40,000 homes in the US for a year. So think about that optimization in performance by moving to something like GraphQL. So this is great, and people love it. There are security aspects that are quite interesting. There are a number of other things that are pretty cool about it. But still, all the API management concerns are there. So since this is HTTP endpoints we're talking about, why can't we just expose them, manage them, socialize them, secure them like traditional RESTful APIs? That's exactly what we can do. The same concern, the same idea of having a gateway that disintermediates my GraphQL server backend from my API consumer frontend is in there. I still want to make those API endpoints available in a catalog for people to discover the kind of data that they want to use. All of those same things are in there in the same way: access control, threat protection. So this is where we're starting to expand to a new form of API management, the one that includes GraphQL. The other protocol that I'm really keen to talk about is, the other interaction pattern is the event-driven interaction pattern. So I'm shifting gears here. I'm moving from synchronous with GraphQL to asynchronous with events. Again, how many people here work with events or event-based APIs or event-driven APIs? Okay, not many, a few. All right. Again, forgive me, I'm going to take this from a very basic point of view. What is the difference between a synchronous interaction, a request, or a request-response pattern, and an event-based interaction, an asynchronous interaction? If you think about an analogy of a mobile phone app, your banking app in this context, a request-response interaction is where you go open the banking app and you do something. For example, a pay now to pay for your coffee. You go in, you say my coffee was $2. You put the number in, you press send, and the payment is sent. You get an immediate acknowledgement that something has happened, and your interaction with the mobile phone app is concluded. That's a synchronous interaction. An asynchronous interaction is where you're walking down the street and your mobile phone rings and it's a notification that tells you you paid for too many coffees, you're in overdraft, you don't have any money on your current bank account. That's something that you haven't stimulated, is the app that reaches out to you. So very simplistic, this distinguishes between requests in the synchronous world at the top of my slide and notifications in the asynchronous world at the bottom of my slide. Realistically, though, things are a bit more complicated than that. There are many more complex patterns. The requests are typically blocking, which means that if you've got cascaded waterfall requests, you cannot get an acknowledgement until all of that process is concluded. So people start to break things down in order to make them a bit more efficient. What really happens when you do that pay now transaction is that you receive an immediate synchronous acknowledgement that that payment request has gone through. Then something happens in the background without you waiting to get that acknowledgement. And a system of record is updated, which probably triggers an event that will then update the state of something else later on. So that pattern in the middle, your request state, is how things really work. And this is to say that we don't live in a world that is purely synchronous or purely asynchronous. It's a world that has got a number of reasons to be able to leverage both interaction patterns. And this boils down pretty quickly to having APIs that are event-driven. And again, why shouldn't I be able to treat event-driven APIs like RESTful APIs? Let me extend that analogy a little bit. What does this mean in practice? First of all, if I've got event-driven APIs, I need to be able to describe them. We talked about Swagger and OpenAPI as a standard. There is a maybe less mature, younger standard called Async API, which is the sister project to OpenAPI for asynchronous events. Pretty similar in construct, in structure, in nature. It tells you what the endpoint is, what is the data that you can pull, how you can get there. So very similar idea, very orientated towards consumers of events. You need to be able to discover those events. Can I have a catalog that tells me all the events that I can have access to and the data that they bring to me? You need to be able to decentralize the access. I don't want to give access to the same people for all the events on my back end. I want to do access control. I want to create policies that get enforced without touching things at the back end, my brokers. And you want to be able to decouple. For security reasons, you want to have the same idea of a gateway between your brokers in your enterprises and your consumers internally or externally. All of this is what we call event endpoint management. The same architectural patterns we matured for API management over 10 years is something we can apply to events as well. It's the idea of having a gateway which understands the event asynchronous protocols I'm using, the same manager to create my policies, create my products, and publish them to that gateway, and the same developer portal to make those endpoints available for consumption and socialization. All of this is generic. I'm now going to talk about why IBM is excited about this, and why I am excited about this is because we've taken all of this thinking and we've built a product that allows you to do what we call multi-form API management. It's got an API manager that is able to understand async APIs and describe them. We've got gateways that understand synchronous protocols, REST, SOAP, also GraphQL, also WebSockets, and a gateway technology that understands asynchronous protocol. We start from Kafka because it's a very popular protocol for asynchronous events. We don't plan to stop there. As I mentioned, there are many more. We've got representation of Solus in the room, which is probably one of the second most popular there, AMQP, MQTT, MQ from IBM. So we're looking at all of this. And Manju again mentioned that companies today have got a multi-gateway strategy, and we acknowledge that. We want to be able, with the same architectural construct that is API management, to manage APIs, synchronous or asynchronous, that run on separate gateways, so that you can have everything in one catalog. All of your business data that is critical to your consumers is displayed there, and if it's in GraphQL or if it's in Kafka, it's their choice to consume it in the different form factors. All right, so this product, and I'm going to stop very soon about IBM, is called API Connect. It's out there. It allows you to create APIs, secure them, management, socialize them. It's been around for almost 10 years. It's been ranked by Gartner, by Forrester, by other analysts as one of the leaders for that length of time. I'm not going to spend much time talking about the why. There are links in this chart. I'm just going to mention one last thing. We're very big on GraphQL. We've recently, as IBM, we've recently acquired a company called StepZen, which is an independent company that created a way of easily creating new GraphQL APIs, and that's become part of our API Connect family. So not only you can expose them and lifecycle manage them, but you can create them from scratch as well. All right, I am short on time, but a bit late, so I'm going to stop here. If you want to hear more with my esteemed colleagues, I'll be at booth 11 all day. Come and chat to us. We'll be very glad to hear from your experience.